for tuning in today. I'm Nicole Forbes with Dennis's 70s, and today we are talking about attracting hummingbirds to your garden, or how to get more hummingbirds into your garden if you already have them. And we're just going to talk a little bit about hummingbirds today because they're really fun to watch, and there's some really interesting facts about them. They're kind of fascinating little birds. And the more we know about them helps us kind of observe and understand when we're watching them in their garden, you know, what's going on. And also then, of course, how to work within their needs and their life cycle. So here in the Portland metro area, where we are today, we have two species of hummingbirds that are present during the summer months, but only one of them stays here year round. And so the two are the Rufous hummingbird and the Anna's hummingbird. But Rufous migrates to Mexico for winter and is just beginning to return at this time of year, or is, you know, coming in often by June. The Rufous hummingbirds have returned to the Portland area. But the Anna's hummingbird is the one that we often see through the winter months, and really ranges in habitat from the Northwest in general and even over to Arizona, looking for sustainable flowers that are blooming throughout the year to feed on, because hummingbirds are nectar feeders primarily, although they also do use a little bit of pollen as a kind of accidental. I think they get pollen as a small protein supply, and insects. So small insects become a highly nutritious and kind of energy-packed food supply for hummingbirds, especially during the breeding season or when they have babies. So that includes spiders, spiders' webs, which they can also consume and they use to build their nests with, as kind of that outer securing lining of their nests. So hummingbirds eat spiders, gnats, fruit flies, mosquitoes even, so things small enough for them to catch, which of course is always fantastic for us to you know, have a natural insect predator in our gardens. Benefits us as well. So they are fun to watch. They you know, thrill us with kind of their aerial antics and sometimes aggressive behavior. And then in addition to that, of course, as I mentioned, we do benefit from them consuming some of our insects too. So one of the kind of better known things about hummingbirds is that they prefer to feed off of flowers that have a specific shape and a specific color. So we do know, and most people are aware of the fact that they prefer tubular or kind of long, elongated tube-shaped flowers, or funnel-shaped flowers, little open bells or even kind of cup shapes to feed off of. That's easiest for them to get their beaks into. Now, some flowers are actually specifically designed for hummingbird beaks to really be the only ones that can get far enough back to get the nectar, and that the flower, of course, isn't trying to get the hummingbird to get the nectar, it's trying to be pollinated. So hummingbirds do quite a bit of pollination as they're moving around from plant to plant as well, by pushing their little faces as far in as they can with that deep, deep beak. And they also have an extremely long tongue. So when we see a hummingbird's long beak, which again goes into these nice tubular shaped flowers, beyond the beak's length is a tongue that can extend at least as long as the beak, if not much, much longer. And when the hummingbird's not using its tongue, it's actually wrapped back up around the upside, like the back of its brain, as a place to kind of rest. So it's got to have somewhere to go as it comes out. So they have some really amazing anatomy. And when it comes to color preference, as we know, red is their favorite color. Now, hummingbirds need to have a regular supply of flowers to feed off of, and they need to eat frequently, and of course every day. Now that means that they can't always go to the things that are their favorites, and sometimes they have to feed off of flowers that are other colors. So when we really talk about, you know, their favorite plants being red or tubular, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's exclusively what they feed off of. And when there become fewer choices in winter, in early spring, or even late fall, fewer choices available for the hummingbirds, they're going to feed off of flowers that deliver them with the energy supply that they need, regardless of the color necessarily of the flower. Now, another really interesting aspect when we talk about flower color and hummingbirds, and birds in general actually, is that hummingbird vision is quite different from human vision. And that means that the colors that a hummingbird sees are the colors that we see and more. So really recent research in the kind of 2020, I think, research has been done on hummingbird color spectrum, or what the visible spectrum is to a hummingbird. And it includes the fact that they actually have 4 different color cones in their eyes, where human beings have 3. We have the red, the green, and the blue cones. Hummingbirds have an additional or 4th cone, which allows them to see like 5 or more different colors beyond our visual spectrum. So when we look at these flowers and we see the colors and the patterns that we see, I'm not even sure we can imagine what a hummingbird sees when they look at it. So I think that that's really wonderful and exciting. And when you look at the male Anna's hummingbird specifically, their ruby colored throat with fuchsias and greens has a very flashy pattern on the underside of their chin and their kind of throat patch, and they can flash that band of feathers to, you know, flirt with girl hummingbirds to really show off how amazing they are. And again, to our eyes, it's like a visual just feat of color that ranges and changes, and whatever a hummingbird sees, it must be even more brilliant and amazing than that. So it is still possible to have flowers that are not red, for example, such as this foxglove is going to be visited by a hummingbird not only frequently, but, you know, is one of their favorites. Great tubular shaped flower to get your beak far up into, kind of attracts them as well. So the right shape doesn't necessarily have to be always the right shape and the right color. Excuse me. And then something such as the Hot Lips Salvia, one of their absolute favorites, isn't very tubular. In fact, you can see a little bit of a tube, but it's got a flare to it at the front as well. So it's not necessarily a big funnel or tube shape, but it's that nice red color. And the hummingbirds are highly attracted to this salvia or flowering sage. But just as likely, they're to go to this little flowering sage as well. So 2 perennials in the same family, salvias. We've got Salvia burgundy candles here, and then Salvia Hot Lips. Both are high on the top of the hummingbirds' preference lists, and the flower shapes and colors really kind of run the gamut. So we'll get more into these specific plant details, but as usual, there is a handout that's attached to this video. It's just under the description of the class video, and we do have a list of plants that are kind of amongst their favorites. But one of the things that's important when we consider attracting something like hummingbirds into our gardens is we want to try to meet all of their needs. So being only a place to eat, for example, is only hitting one aspect of the needs of a hummingbird, And if we are able to provide a few other elements of hummingbird habitat, then we're likely to have a hummingbird that feels more comfortable in our yards, to possibly even choose our garden for a place to lay a nest or to frequently visit as part of their kind of feeding routine, and even, you know, for mating antics and all of those types of things. So if you're a safe place that provides more elements of habitat, that would include food, as we mentioned, shelter, a place to raise young, excuse me, food, shelter, a place to raise young, water, which is very critical, and cover. So, you know, again, that safety, somewhere to perch, somewhere to observe the yard before coming down low to feed off of some of the lower flowering plants is important for hummingbirds to survey and assess. So of course they can be, as we know, even you know, a fast home yard cat, you know, or neighborhood cat can catch a hummingbird if they're fast. They do come low enough from time to time to feed off of, you know, perennials that are maybe 2-3 feet tall, which means they are in a vulnerable space as they're hovering and trying to feed off of these flowers. So we want to consider having cover, like large shrubs or kind of different layers of plants in our gardens near the hummingbird favorites, so that they can kind of dash into safety or quickly fly to safety if threatened. So cover, that's what cover really means. But again, food is only one of those. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have a garden that has layers, as I mentioned, larger upper story trees perhaps, maybe some hedges or hedge rows that gives you kind of a mid layer of evergreen, dense greenery, and then, you know, deciduous trees or lower, smaller trees down into smaller shrubs, and finally down to perennials and ground covers. All of those different layers provide different habitat needs, and then that includes for hummingbirds. They prefer to nest in like a evergreen, something that's dense and has some protection from wind. And as you see on the handout, our Anna's hummingbird is one of the earliest breeding hummingbirds of the North American kind of groups, and often they lay their first clutch of eggs as early as December, but it can be December, January, February, even March. And usually they have 2 nestings a year, so it could be December or February, and then again towards June or July. The nests are very small, and the eggs obviously even smaller, like half the size of a jelly bean, you know, a good sized jelly bean. And so wind is what can really endanger these nests. They choose to lay them in maybe horizontal branches of nice dense evergreens that have some wind protection. Also, the need for a hummingbird to dash out while nesting to grab a high energy snack includes gnats and fruit flies and things like that. So I often find that the addition of honestly, even a compost pile, maybe you have some fruit flies that'll accumulate on your compost pile, but there's now even a fruit fly feeder that you can purchase. I think the Backyard Bird Shop sells a fruit fly feeder that you can purchase and actually allow some flies, fruit flies, to kind of breed inside a small container outside, and the hummingbirds then can go straight to that and eat the little fruit flies. So beyond nectar, you know, think about that you could actually feed a high protein food source, and by offering that consistent high protein food source, you are increasing the odds that a hummingbird's going to be like, you know, this is a great place to raise a family. Food is plentiful, and it's always there, so that, you know, I'm gonna set up a nest and raise my young right here. So that's a very exciting thing to find that you may have, you know, a nest in your garden. Water, although hummingbirds drink nectar and get a lot of the moisture that they need to intake through the nectar that they drink, they also need to stay clean and keep, you know, keep themselves pest-free by cleaning their feathers and doing regular hygiene and preening, but they don't use a typical bird bath. So those of us that, again, enjoy watching birds in our garden, enjoy all of the kind of splashing and activity of the birds in the bird bath, but you may notice that there's never groups of hummingbirds that join in the, you know, groups at the bird bath. Hummingbirds do not take bird baths, or don't take baths in general. In fact, they typically shower and prefer to either, you know, fly swiftly through a dense shrubbery or tree after it's rained and get the raindrops kind of on them, and then they'll go up to a tree and kind of preen or clean their feathers and get the rainwater to come through their feathers. Or they'll fly through sprinklers. If you have one of those old style sprinklers that goes back and forth like an arc, you'll often see a hummingbird sitting nearby and waiting for just the right timing and flying through the little arc of water from your sprinklers. And fountains themselves, whether the fountain has a little gurgle perhaps at the top of the fountain, or I have a fountain at home that's 2-tier, and the water drops like 3 feet, you know, or something from the top tier to the bottom tier. So a long stream of water falls from the top of the fountain, and hummingbirds both fly straight through the stream of water, as well as sit right at the top of at the top of my water feature where the water comes out. They sit right at the top and let the water kind of spill over top of their, you know, spill over their bottoms, I guess. It's like a hummingbird bidet, little spa that they use there. So they have no knees, which means they cannot step into a deep bird bath or get into a situation like regular songbirds or other birds do, where they crouch into the bird bath and get the water over top of them and kind of work it down their bodies. Hummingbirds without knees, again, won't go into deep water situations and don't even walk very well. So they do kind of a funny shuffle. They're great at perching, but those legs, you know, are probably underdeveloped as a sacrifice for all of the other, you know, amazing parts of the wing and flight apparatuses that hummingbirds have. And they need to be very lightweight too. So there's some biological sacrifices that are being usually traded off for that. The importance of having water and flowers in bloom throughout the year is really what makes the difference in having hummingbirds stay in your garden and be regular visitors if they don't make nests there. So that means that we need to have things in bloom from you know, winter through spring, and then summer perennials, which are a lot easier to access, and there's more choices in the peak of summer, and then going into fall and of course early winter, we need to make sure that there's something flowering for the hummingbirds in our gardens. You can also supplement with a hummingbird feeder, and that's one of those things that in my garden I only supplement a feeder during the winter months, when although I still have things in bloom in my garden, I still want to add some additional food sources because I've got a high population of hummingbirds in my garden. So going through the different plants that are in bloom at different times of year, and again, you will have this kind of information on your handout. There's a range of shrubs, vines. Some of these are native to the Pacific Northwest, although I don't have a ton of native plants with me today. The bloom times include different times of year, and some things again that bloom earlier in the season I don't have in stock at the moment, simply because they're out of season, I guess you would say. But if we started in winter, camellias and the Sasangua camellia, Yuletide is one of their favorites. So clearly Yuletide is a red single flowering camellia that often blooms here in the Portland area from late November, frequently until the first of the year or through the new year. So November, December and January, that's critical month that not a lot of other plants are flowering. So winter bloomers include fall and winter bloomers, then that's Sasangua camellia and other colors and varieties of Sasangua camellias that hummingbirds, although it's not tubular flower, the Yuletide is red, so it's a great color for them, but they'll go visit white flowers and pink flowers just the same. So winter Sasangua camellias are great. Then coming into anywhere from, again, November through January, different varieties of Oregon grape, one of our native plants, formerly known as Mahonia, but is now being reclassified as a berberis. That's just like botanical blah blah blah, but if you are a botanical blah blah blah, that made sense to you. But Mahonias or Oregon grape are now making little fruits, so tiny little berries that are being formed at the ends of our plant here came from the flowers that had bloomed earlier in the spring. So the Oregon grape makes a kind of a yellowish spike of flowers that bloom very early and are also visited by bees and hummingbirds and are native to the Pacific Northwest. Then they make an edible fruit that is kind of like a grape. There's the name Oregon grape. They're edible, but they don't taste great, but birds think so. So songbirds and other fruit-eating birds will later enjoy the wonderful fruit that's provided from the Oregon grape. So you get bee and hummingbird attracting flowers early in the season. This is an evergreen that is fairly dense, and it's not exactly prickly, but it can be a little bit pokey. Not holly sharp, but sort of sharp. So it's also decent cover, so it provides some cover for habitat. And then later in the season as well, that fruit that gives songbirds something to eat. So you're really kind of hitting a lot of different wildlife aspects with something like the native Oregon grape and many of our other native plants. So that's again November through January, February, sometimes even March, depending on the variety of Oregon grape. Then one of the absolute favorites that begins coming into bloom for hummingbirds is another one of our natives. Now this happens to be a cultivar of the native. This is red flowering currant, and this is King Edward VII variety. So I don't know, again, if you can get close, Becky, to see, because it's not in bloom any longer, it has a fantastic cluster that kind of drops down. So like pendant style flowers that are hot pink. They're not truly red. They're more of like a hot pink to light pink. And blooming early enough that none of this other stuff is in flower yet. So the hummingbirds really key in on where these plants are located in neighborhoods and go to homes that have things like red flowering currant blooming in that February, March time frame, because it's critical time when they don't have a lot of other choices. Now, next in blooming, so now we're into like February, March, bordering into going into April, and even some varieties are blooming late enough that it is now May. This is a super common landscape plant that many of us have in our gardens in the Pacific Northwest, and you may have never noticed that it is attractive to honeybees, all kinds of native pollinator bees, and hummingbirds. And it's also lightly fragrant. So this is a really great useful plant in many ways, and it's called Piers Japonica. This is a variety here called Purity, so it's kind of a mid-sized white flower, grows 3 to 4 feet tall and wide, takes sun or partial sun, kind of filtered light, grows great with rhododendrons and azaleas and camellias and kind of a dappled sunlight type garden. And as I mentioned, it's evergreen. Yep, this one's lightly fragrant. And they're not red, again, they're not very tubular, but they are little bell-shaped flowers and they are full of nectar. And so this is another one of those plants that you will see hummingbirds come and visit. And there are many varieties of the Piers Japonica that, although most bloom white, there are varieties that have a reddish pink flower cluster. And as you can imagine, those are even more mind-blowing for a hummingbird at the right time of year when it's like my favorite. I didn't even think I could get my favorite right now. So, they're thrilled with that. And beyond some varieties of Piers Japonica, Mountain Fire, Forest Flame, those two specific varieties, but many others, rather than have red flowers, actually have reddish new growth that comes out right about the time that they've finished flowering or coinciding with the flowers. The new growth comes out with kind of a red color or red accent, and that also is most likely getting the hummingbird's eyes and grabbing their attention as they're flying above. So now we're into that was February and March, and even beyond April with that Piers blooming. Then we start looking for what's coming into bloom in the perennial garden. Early season flowers that hummingbirds enjoy include some of our blooming bulbs, so hyacinths, even some of the more tubular shaped trumpet narcissus or daffodils hummingbirds will feed off of. Bleeding hearts, believe it or not, are also visited by hummingbirds, so some of our early blooming bleeding hearts. Now, as we get into May, we are really starting to enjoy an ever increasing palette of perennials and even some annuals and tender, what we'll call tropicals, that are really upping your game. If you bring these into your garden, I just wouldn't be surprised if you didn't bring a hummingbird home from the garden center with you at the same time. So as I do want to go through some of these favorites, again, you will see beyond what I'm talking about today. I just grabbed what we have, but beyond that, and hopefully most of the things that I've already mentioned will be on the handout, as you can make reference to it after the class. And most of the Genesis 70s garden centers, if not all of us, have actually organized our perennial section specifically to be by kind of category, and there is exclusively a table that is flowers for hummingbirds and butterflies. So many of these plants came directly off of the hummingbird table, for example, in the perennial section, which means that it's a no-brainer. If you want to just come in and buy flowers that are pretty to you, as long as you find them on the hummingbird table, you're likely to be assured they're also be popular hummingbirds as well. So going through what is, again, kind of a wide variety of plants, I'm going to kind of quickly talk about ones that I think are really fun. And just if you look at the table, I have some shade plants over in on this side, including hostas, which you may say, well, hostas, there's no flower on a hosta. What's a hummingbird going to be after on a hosta? Well, if you watch hostas throughout the season, hostas do produce a flower stalk. So it is a long, kind of tall, thin stalk with tubular, white or usually kind of pale lavender, sometimes pink, kind of wonderful trumpet-shaped flowers. Many hosta varieties flowers are fragrant, and they're actually in the lily family. So they have, like a lily scent and are kind of lily shaped little trumpets that hummingbirds enjoy visiting. So when your hosta comes into bloom, you will obviously be able to see hummingbirds be attracted to it. In addition to shade hostas, there are also several other plants that thrive in shade that hummingbirds like. As I mentioned, the bleeding heart, that was one that blooms earlier in the season. And one that blooms towards the fall is the Japanese anemone. And that is, again, more of a cup-shaped or kind of bowl-shaped flower. Comes in pink or white, not red. But hummingbirds, as I mentioned, start to have limited options as less and less of their favorite plants are blooming, and so they will go for a plant that may not be the top on their list, just so that they're sure that they get a meal. Now, hardy fuchsias, which are a perennial type of fuchsia, are one of those plants that will grow in dappled sun or kind of partial shade all the way up to quite a bit of sun. So they are tolerant of a range of lighting. They will bloom better for you in more sun, but probably need a little bit more watering at the same time. And the hardy fuchsia plants range in size, but in general, they are kind of borderline between a small bush and a large perennial. So this is a really beautiful variety with one of the smaller flowers of the group. This is a pure white flower, kind of a greenish outside and a pure white tiny flower. This is a variety of fuchsia called hawkshead. And hawkshead can actually get up to about 4 feet tall or even more, and wide. So, not as tall as I am, but up to maybe my chest or my shoulders. Nice big full wide plant covered in these flowers from usually spring till frost. So like May through October, a very long bloom time on hardy fuchsias. Other side of the kind of size that you can find in flowers on hardy fuchsias, this is Yolanda Frank, which I should look up who Yolanda Frank was or is, but I have no idea. Yolanda Frank has a much larger flower. It's not completely open yet, so you can't see that, wonderful kind of bicolored tube and skirt, or what they call sepal and corolla in fuchsia language. But this is again, long blooming perennial, hardy to our zone, with the larger drooping style flowers. And just to kind of show you, in case you're not familiar with fuchsias, what fuchsia flowers really look like, we have a hanging basket of fuchsias here that is not a hardy fuchsia. I mean, people do successfully winter over the hanging basket fuchsias, but look at this crazy flower. So this came off of the hanging basket and is just like pink and purple with shades of magenta. You can see the inside, of course, is kind of a complex network of ruffles that a hummingbird will have to, wiggle their little beaks to get into, but they don't mind. It's like eating something that's a little bit difficult to eat. It's worth the effort if you get a good payoff. So this hanging basket of fuchsia is great for morning sun, is one of those fantastic summer kind of traditions that gives us long blooms on our porch or our patio and brings those birds even closer to us than perhaps out into the garden, and an example of what you see from them. But the the hardy fuchsias, as we're talking about, the ones that come back year after year in your garden, can have a flower as small as this one that I just took off of hawkshead. So hawkshead, hardy fuchsia, compared to the giant kind of gaudy hanging basket fuchsia, really shows you the wide range of this flower's color, flower size, and sort of, double, single, drama. I guess that's a good word for it. But hummingbirds love them both or all just the same. Now beyond hardy fuchsia, oh, a word about hardy fuchsias. So hardy fuchsia, hardy, we use that word to differentiate. Hardy is the ones that come back. Hardy are the ones that come back. The annual fuchsias or non-hardy fuchsias are more sensitive to cold weather and usually are not expected to return after winter. Now you can take a hanging basket of a tender or an annual style fuchsia and stick it in your garage or a garden shed, and let it just not freeze. Keep it pretty warm, you know, not warm, don't like bring it in the house, but just keep it protected over the winter. And usually you can bring it back out this time of year and see that it has survived. Then you can cut it back, kind of feed it, maybe stimulate the, you know, repot it if the soil's kind of gross. And usually you can get that fuchsia to come back again the second year or even more. With the perennial or hardy fuchsias, they should be planted in the ground because they do grow to be decent sized, at least, let's say, 2 feet, 2.5 feet, on up to 4 and 5 feet tall and wide, so little bushes. They bloom until frost, and then they do go to sticks in the winter, so they will drop their leaves after a hard frost. The most critical thing about hardy fuchsias in the ground is that you avoid the temptation to prune them back in the fall as they have dropped their leaves. So they look like sticks in your garden, and you need to leave them as is in the garden as sticks until spring. And in the spring, as you see new growth begin on the old sticks from last year and around the ground, the base of the fuchsia will push new growth. As you see that new growth return, then you can prune your fuchsia back down to either your desired size or even close to the ground, or just right to where you see the green beginning. There is likely to be some frost kill or tip dieback on the outer edges of that plant that'll require some cutting back. Now I have found that the sticks that remain on my fuchsia in the wintertime happen to also be a great perch for hummingbirds that are hanging out in my garden through the winter. So they're always looking for places to perch and hang out. That includes wires, power lines and telephone wires and all of that. They love to perch on those. This time of year, as I've put my tomatoes into the garden, the hummingbirds love to perch on tomato cages. It just seems like it's the perfect gauge of wire and just a great, you know, usually that gives them a good vantage point in the garden. Probably also access to gnats and little tiny insects that are flying around in the vegetable garden that they can dart out and eat. So tomato cages make a great perch, but I do find them often perching on the kind of old twigs of my hardy fuchsias in the winter, in early spring, and then I cut them back. Now from hardy fuchsias, we have a plant in front that looks a lot like a fuchsia and even has fuchsia in its name, but it's not a true fuchsia. So this is what's called a cape fuchsia, cape like Superman wears, and then fuchsia. But the botanical name on this is not fuchsia like these. Botanically, this is a Phygelius. And to further confuse things, that is Phygelius with a P, so P-H-Y. Phygelius, or cape fuchsias, have this really long, tubular, trumpet-shaped flower that all blooms up a stem, so we can see the kind of lighter color in the center of this nice tube. And the way that the flowers bloom starts low on the stem, and now we've got new flowers developing up and up and up on an elongated stem. Cape fuchsias or Phygelius do great in full sun or partial shade. This variety here gets again about 2 to 3 feet tall. This is called cherry ripe. So this is one color, but they come in kind of mangoes and peaches and oranges and a salmon color. I've even seen a white and a yellow. They can spread quite a bit in the garden, so you can end up with them at least 3 feet wide or more. They are long blooming and drought tolerant, and as you may, you probably can't see all the great stuff on the tag, but they're also deer resistant. So deer tend to leave the Cape Fuchsia or Phygelius alone, and as well, hummingbirds are highly attracted to them. And these bloom well into the summer also, so not quite as long probably as the hardy fuchsias, but really a great bloomer. Soon to be flowering in my garden and here at the garden center and all over are different varieties of bee balm. So bee balm is, I heard today's World Bee Day, so happy World Bee Day. And bees love bee balm too. So a lot of these flowers are popular for bees. If you like bees, bees will like your hummingbird garden and just come along as a bonus. But bee balm is another one of hummingbirds' absolute favorite plants, and it's a super cool perennial as well. This is a short dwarf form of bee balm. It's called bee balm balmy rose. Sorry, I can't read upside down. So balmy rose. We have balmy pink, balmy purple. This is dwarf. This is a dwarf variety, so like a foot tall, a foot wide. It is just starting to set the flower buds that'll be in bloom in another couple of weeks. Bee balm, or monarda, the botanical name for bee balm, includes a very tall variety called Jacob Klein that can get 3 to 4 feet tall and is like bright red, scarlet red, but ranges to kind of a raspberry and a pink and a purple, and from that very tall to a foot tall. So nice range of size and perennials. If you have a smaller garden, you would probably want to stick with a smaller plant. Bee balms prefer moist soil. They are more of a like mid to late spring bloomer, and like many perennials flower for 6 or 8 weeks and then they're done. So not quite as long blooming as some of the other ones that we're looking at. Moist soil, as I mentioned, and these do best in full sun. They are a little bit prone to, many varieties are prone to a powdery mildew that comes on late in the summer. So to avoid that, you want to grow them in as much sun as you possibly can. And they also have, I'm patting it because it smells great. So they have an herbal fragrance that is because they are closely related to bergamot, which of course is the herbal essence or flavor that gives Earl Grey tea its kind of particular flavor and aroma. They are also in the mint family, which if you roll the stems of bee balm in your fingers, monarda stems or all mint family stems are actually square. So rather than being able to roll a round stem in your fingers, you'll hit little square edges as you try to roll that square stem in your hands. Now, plants in the mint family can be spreaders, and especially in the more moist the soil is, you can end up with a slightly aggressive spreader. This is by no means an aggressive spreader, but it is going to make a nice kind of mound or clump over time. So monarda needs a little bit of space to spread, and doesn't necessarily do so well in a pot because it does like that extra moist soil. Another plant that will be in bloom within the next, let's say 6 weeks or so. I think the flower bud's still kind of tight in the stems here. This is Krokozmia. And Krokozmia, the tag is so small it doesn't really even give it any indication of how beautiful these flowers are, but brilliant scarlet red flowers and a long stem that are kind of tubular flowers on either side of a long stem. This is a variety called Lucifer, and we're talking 3 to 4 feet or so tall when it's in full bloom. Krokozmia comes from a corm or a bulb, a type of bulb, and so often that can be found in early spring with assorted other perennial bulbs like dahlias and begonias and lilies, and then come up from bulb. Or you can find the plants themselves at the garden center like you can this time of year. But as other plants that are in the bulb, that grow from bulbs, Krokozmia will naturalize and kind of spread out over time. So you will have this plant fill it in so that it is at least a patch of a foot and a half, 2 feet wide as it establishes. Now, Krokozmia only blooms for, again, 6 weeks or so, but when it is in bloom, hummingbirds camp out by the plant to make sure that they just maximize their time with it. So it is beloved by many. It is very popular and does great in full sun, but it even takes a fair amount of shade. If you are local in the Lake Oswego area where I am today, you will see Krokozmia in a lot of the city planting strips, median strips, and other kind of municipal plantings. So that also shows that it's really sturdy, drought tolerant, and spreads and is low maintenance. One thing to note about Krokozmia late in the season is it is prone to spider mites. So at the end of kind of the summer, when it gets really hot, really dry, Krokozmia being a bulb, the foliage will start to kind of yellow and look bad anyway. So as that happens, you can just cut it to the ground and just get rid of it. So it's done flowering for the year, its foliage starts to die back, just like your tulips are now and your daffodils have done. You can cut that foliage off and remove it. Another super cool perennial for best in full sun is Agapanthus, or I know I'm not saying it right, it's like Augustiki or something, but I can't say that. So this is another plant in the mint family, similar to Monarda, has a square stem. This has a wonderful kind of anise, licorice type or anise aroma to it as you smell the foliage. And then the blooms are just starting to come out. So just beginning with their little tubes, starting to come out of these clusters, but a nice long stem, long bloom time with tons and tons of flowers. We have flower buds on almost every little tip of every extended piece of this plant. Also known as hyssop or anise hyssop. It can be used as an edible. It is again deer resistant, fragrant, attracts bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, best in full sun, and the size ranges. So you can find short varieties and very tall varieties. They need excellent drainage. So not only full sun, but that clay soil that we have needs to be worked a bit to make sure that they make it through our winter. But they're hardy to negative temperatures. So it's not the cold that gets them, it's often the wet muck of winter. Hummingbirds adore them, and as I mentioned, they're just coming into bloom, but they will bloom until almost frost, so a late season bloomer. Another one that is requires excellent drainage are the salvias. So I've got some of the most popular salvias, as I mentioned, but the range of flowering sages or perennial sages really runs the gamut. This is Burgundy Candles, and this is Hot Lips. Now, Hot Lips is blooming right now with just the kind of pinky red flowers that are representative of how this flower blooms in early spring. So during cool weather, it's a single color bloom. But as the weather warms up into more consistent summer month conditions, Hot Lips will develop a white patch on the flower as well. So it'll have red or that pinkish red as well as a white, which gives it that Hot Lips name, I guess. But it does also look, when you look close up, it kind of looks like little lips or a mouth. So hummingbirds adore it. Full sun is best. Well draining soil. Hot Lips is kind of borderline, so some people may have lost it this year in the ice storms that we had, but in most cases it's easily makes it through a mild winter, especially if planted in the ground. Can get to be a good sized plant, so easily 3 to 4 feet tall, 3 to 5 feet wide, copious blooms from May or June all the way through till August or even beyond. And as I mentioned, hardy perennials, these salvias. There is also tender salvias. There are also tender salvias. And I just brought one as an example because it's pretty amazing with its flowers. So we see our perennial salvia and then a tender salvia. This is Rockin Deep Purple is the name of this salvia. I think they're coming up with some slightly dumb names these days, but you know, whatever. Everybody's got to come up with their own name. So Rockin Deep Purple comes in a series. There's pink and lavender and a couple of other really great colors, but we're also looking at a fairly tall plant, 30 to 40 inches. Great deep green leaf, square stems, upright flowering habit. Although we have secondary bloom stalks down lower on the plant, you'll have kind of one phenomenal flower stalk, then secondaries, and then it continues to bloom beyond that. So a little deadheading is great, but this gives a whole season's worth of attracting hummingbirds to your garden, and sometimes it winters over as well. So you may get the more tender salvias to come back year after year, but sometimes they don't as well. So that's why they're considered tender. Another wonderful perennial that needs good drainage and full sun in your garden is Penstemon. So this is a Penstemon, also known as beard tongue. This variety is called Blackbeard, and you can see it's got this great dark foliage. So it adds to kind of just the drama and attractiveness in the garden to have that dark leaf. And the little tubular pink flowers. Now Penstemon are also loved by bees and pollinators. So all kinds of honeybees and bumblebees will crawl inside that Penstemon flower too. But they'll just kind of line up with the hummingbirds that want to come and drink off of the Penstemons as well. Penstemon come in a range of colors, so you'll see red and pink and electric blue and purple, and a lot of them have green foliage, but the Blackbeard here has the darker leaf. Now, the last perennial that's kind of low up front that I know I was going to forget about. This is a later bloomer and another great dark leafed perennial. So we have the similarities of these two gorgeous dark leaves, which give us great drama and comparison against greener leaves in the perennial garden. This is a variety of lobelia. Believe it or not, there are perennial lobelias. So if you only know lobelias for bedding plants and hanging baskets and things, this is an upright perennial lobelia. This is called Cardinal Vulcan Red. This one's called Vulcan Red. It is as red can get. And what lobelia does is will form similar to foxglove. It's going to elongate with a tall flower spike in summer. So it's more of a summer bloomer, not yet in flower, but that gives us more extended bloom time in our garden. And so a big tall flower spike can easily be, again, up to almost 3 feet tall. Lobelia also love moisture, so they grow in areas where you've got maybe low spots, boggy soil, kind of wetter soil conditions, even at the edge of a pond. That's where they're happy, and certainly not the opposite. They are not tolerant of drought and don't want to dry out, but their flower is like a stunning red color and highly attractive to hummingbirds. Speaking of highly attractive and stunning red color, now we're into our annuals. So Mandevilla is a tropical, we would call it here in the Portland area, not able to survive on its own outside, although you could bring this plant in and grow it under lights, probably indoors through the winter. but the long blooming, and again, large flowers of the Mandevilla are tubular, and a great food source for extra hummingbirds that come to the garden. Comes in red or white or pink, so there's a range of colors there. And another really great one that blooms until frost, and often we don't see this all the time in the garden center, and I don't have the best specimen to show yet because it's so early in the season. This is a flowering maple, and the inside, you can kind of just see what an amazing flower this is. It's kind of orangey red with veining on the petals, and almost like a hibiscus high center. Once this flower fully opens, it's a tall, tender perennial, easily 4 to 5 feet tall. It has no relation to a maple, but you can see with the leaf that it has, it looks like a maple. So the name flowering maple comes from that leaf, but its botanical name is Abutilon. And Abutilon also come in a range of heights and colors, but they will continue to flower up the stem with these kind of bell-shaped blossoms that come all the way up and will bloom high up in the plant as the season progresses. Another one that will bloom from early summer until fall, and hummingbirds adore. There's another salvia, forgot to show this one, that's pineapple sage. It smells like pineapples, is this gorgeous golden color, and has a bright red tubular flower that blooms late in the summer, sometimes even doesn't bloom till fall. So pineapple sage just goes great with all the other salvias, even your tender, the Rockin deep purple or whatever it was called. And then the last three, got one more minute. The last three are also annuals. This is flowering tobacco, also known as Nicotiana. Nicotiana, you can see again that fabulous tubular shaped flower with kind of a little flare at the top that gives a nice attractive beacon of color to the hummingbirds as they're flying by. Now butterflies also enjoy flowering tobacco, Nicotiana, and often this is also visited by moths, and there's a white form that is night fragrant. We're going to talk about next week in our class on night gardens. But the wafting aroma of some varieties of Nicotiana at night lure moths in to feed off of them. But during the day, the nectar can be stolen by hummingbirds, and especially on ones like this. So, and they will, because they're aggressive, as we all know when we watch them. But top on their list of annual flowers for sun that get the hummingbirds again and again and again. You can put these in your pots. You can put them in your hanging baskets. They are long blooming, high performing, easy care annuals. Both of these plants are in the same family, and the species is called Koofia, and that's with a C. So Cuphea, Koofia. Oops, I could just show you the tag. One of the probably most common and most beloved is Vermillionaire. So this variety, Vermillionaire, is again, absolute favorite of hummingbirds. Gets about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. It has little orange tubular blossoms that kind of look like cigars, or so sometimes it's called cigar plant, although don't get that confused with other plants called cigar plant. But this little tube is just irresistible for a hummingbird. So they adore it. It's not the most showy plant for, us. You can kind of look almost past it and not see the flowers, but it has an enhanced aspect in the garden, which is that there's like a hummingbird attached to the plant practically all the time. So that ups its attractiveness in my eyes. And then a little bit more of a showy flower in the Koofia family is this one here. Now, sometimes you'll see this variety of Koofia called firecracker, but I have also seen it called bat face or tiny mice. bat face. I think you can probably see the bat face there. Or, I don't know, tiny mice. Maybe from behind, it could look like little mouse ears from behind. But again, we have this lovely tube-shaped flower, some embellishments to attract the birds and the bees. But the overall concept again is hummingbirds, of course, will find their favorites, but they don't always have too many choices depending on times of year. Something in bloom, something with the nectar content, as well as other critical aspects of habitat, as you'll find on the list, are all great ways to increase hummingbird populations in your garden, keep them for longer durations during the season, and potentially even find yourself with a nest and a growing hummingbird family in your garden, as I did this spring. Again, I hope you learned something today, and I hope you go out and enjoy your hummingbirds. And with that, I bid you good day. Thank you for watching. Happy gardening.